South Africa's gross domestic product grew by 1.9% in the first 3 months of this year. Releasing the data earlier today, Statistics South Africa said the size of our economy has returned to normal levels as before COVID-19 pandemic.
As we can see that we are now on the right-hand side as of Q1 2022, sitting at 1.153 trillion. And indeed, we can see that when during the second quarter of 2020, we had gone to about 952 billion, which had dropped from the first quarter of 1.148 trillion. So as we are looking at it now, we are almost at similar levels where we were during the fourth quarter of 2018, which was relatively higher than we were just before we were hit by the pandemic. So while our economy certainly has had challenges during COVID-19, like any other economy, it is bouncing back to similar levels where it was before the pandemic.
For more of what this good news means for South Africa, I'm joined by economist and lecturer at Wits University, Lumkile Mondi. Lumkile, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Certainly, this data shows that the first quarter is one that performed very well. When you couple it with the unemployment data that came out, it also shows that this moves in tandem. But this also shows that indeed, those COVID-19 restrictions being loosened has done a good effect on the South African economic activity.
Absolutely. We are very much encouraged that our real GDP has returned to pre-COVID levels. However, we are worried that the mining sector on the productive side has held steadily, and the construction continue to shrink, and of course the consumer has been one of the biggest boosters for the economy, continuing to spend really in the first quarter. However, we believe that for the consumer going forward in the second quarter, the consumer is going to be impacted upon by the rising fuel prices and food prices. So we're concerned about the expenditure side of our GDP, that going forward it may start declining and therefore return us to lower levels below 1.9, so encouraging for the first quarter.
What does it tell you that household final consumption increased 1.4% in the first quarter? As you have mentioned, consumers are under pressure with the high cost of living. So the second quarter, you feel that it does not bode well for consumers going forward for the rest of the year?
Absolutely. The consumer is going to be pressurized because every part of household expenditure is under pressure, whether it's food, whether it's clothing, whether it's transport. But more importantly also for South Africa are the floods that we saw in KZN, which have destroyed infrastructure and undermined employment opportunities because of the impact in the broader economy. And so I believe that coupled with the strike at Sibanye that has just been resolved, that all those really paint a difficult picture for the second quarter of the GDP figure that will come around August. So we should be concerned about South Africans, and consumers should continue really controlling and managing their expenditures, because I think we're going to be in this tough period for quite some time, because not only is the war impacting on the cost side, but also the supply constraints that we've had since the lockdowns of the economies at the beginning of the COVID crisis across the world.
One of the sectors, Lumkile, that had everybody worried is, of course, the leisure sector. And if you look at the data that came out from the second quarter, it contributed 0.4 percentage points to the first quarter data after increasing 3.1% when it comes to that activity. And that's trade, catering, and accommodation. This bodes well for the leisure sector. It means that people are traveling more, and it goes back to that question about the COVID-19 restrictions.
Well, I believe that a lot of that comes from the fact that people are tired of being locked in at home, not seeing their loved ones. So I believe that that sector is not sustainable going forward. It is not sustainable going forward because the management domestically of the COVID pandemic, in comparison to what we see in Europe and the rest of the world, whereby people are free to move, they are free to mix in terms of entertainment and sports. In South Africa, we still have some restrictions. So the combination of shrinking incomes for many households and the fact that many now households have at least saw or met their families and loved ones across the nation, that's not going to be happening in the second quarter and more quarters going forward because of the cost of living. So I don't think that we should really hope that much. Of course, South Africa still has got a huge opportunity on foreign travel coming inward to South Africa. And we need, therefore, to really value and ensure that our airports are welcoming, that the queues that we see at our ports are addressed so that foreign travelers can come in here and be welcomed to sustain the sector in the event that our consumer is unable to sustain the growth of the hospitality and catering sector, as we have seen the figures in the first quarter.
One of the other sectors that has been a worry for many since before COVID-19, the advent of COVID-19 in 2020, has been investments. A total gross fixed capital formation, as they call it, has been on the low side for the past 2 years, or even 3 years if you go back. And when you look at the data for the first quarter of this year, it shows that there was an increase in investments of 3.6%. And it's going to those industries that are actually gearing for more expected activity, as we don't have those restrictions and we don't expect those restrictions to be around. What does this mean for South Africa's economy?
So for South Africa, we think those were based on the expectation that we're going through a post-COVID period, that the supply constraint that we've seen during the lockdowns were going to be removed. I think the war is the biggest constraint for the sustainability of the investment drive that we've seen in the first quarter. I think many businesses who were prepared to invest continuously may be asking themselves about how the world is going to be when the settlement is going to happen in the European war. Therefore, we will hold their expenditure in investment for some time with the hope that the dark cloud that you see globally does clear, and therefore they can continue and sustain the investment because there's certainty to the future. In its absence, I also don't see that investment drive sustaining itself, except, of course, in the energy generation sector, where because of insecurity around energy, that we see many municipalities playing a bigger role in terms of procurement, as well as households investing on their own security, and in doing so, driving some of that expenditure. So it's a very risky figure with the global order being in such disorder and disarray. And until a settlement is found, I think the investment drive is going to be a challenge, not only for South Africa, but I think globally, due to this capital that we see because of the war, but also because we're undergoing an unprecedented period where there's global realignment politically, which will usher a much more diversified power centers than the unipolar that we've seen led by the Americans and their partners in Europe within NATO.
Lumkile, of course, before I let you go, something really important, the floods in KZN. We saw the impact that those floods had when it comes to Transnet and its ability to export. And when you look at net exports, they contributed negatively because of what happened when it comes to those floods in KZN. That contributed negatively. And when you look at imports, however, there was a 4.9% growth. This is important not only for job creation, but for economic activity to continue at this level for the foreseeable future.
So this is the biggest risk that South Africa faces, that when there is a change in demand for our commodities, particularly coming from Europe, with countries like Germany reviving their coal power generation capabilities and demanding coal from South Africa, and South Africa not being able to export due to the infrastructure constraints, the Transnet, which have been destroyed by corruption and inefficiency, but lately by the floods that we saw in KZN. That remains a big concern for South Africa. So I doubt that South Africa will recover as fast as it can around our export capabilities, particularly around the commodities and other hard exports that require rail than road. Even on the road side, if you've got a port infrastructure deficiency, as we know with Transnet and investment, that's going to be a challenge for Africa. So really the policy choice that South Africa faces is bringing in more private sector players into the logistic infrastructure, including our ports, so that we can get other players that have pockets to invest in infrastructure and therefore allow the inflow and outflow of our goods to be efficient, to meet the global demand and impact on jobs, impact on our foreign exchange, and therefore continue to drive our economic growth, enabling the South African revenue services to collect as much revenue to sustain the income, particularly for those unemployed, and the call for us to extend the grant that we have provided to offset the impact of COVID going forward.
Lumkile Mondi, economist and lecturer at Wits University, thank you very much for your time. Him reacting to the good numbers that came in better than expected for the first quarter of GDP.